The media are really clever at manipulating us and pitting us against each other, spying on each other and sort of thinking that someone else might be getting more than you, or maybe someone isn't working quite as hard as you are for your tax dollars or whatever. And the media seem to be able to whip us into a bit of a frenzy. I noticed it when I first moved back to Victoria about 5 or 6 years ago. They had these really strict water restrictions. People were showering in a bucket and not flushing their toilet, and they could get fined for washing their cars or watering their grass. And I noticed there was this full-on advertising campaign on TV that sort of seemed to encourage you to spy on your neighbours, and there was a hotline set up so that you could actually ring up and dob in a neighbour. And I remember thinking, wow, they're really spending a lot of money on this advertising campaign. And so I thought I'd do some research and actually see how much water we would need to save in order to make a difference to the drought. And I found out that out of the total water consumption in Victoria, only 4% of it was used by residential customers. All the rest was used by industry and agriculture. And I thought, wow, all that money spent, telling us to, recycle every drop of water or whatever. And in reality, even if every man, woman and child in Victoria never used another drop of water again, it was only going to make 4% of difference. And I thought, why didn't they spend that money instead of spending it on a commercial telling us to spy on our neighbours, or a telephone hotline so that we could ring up and dob our neighbours in? Why couldn't they have spent that money sort of developing ways that industry could use water more efficiently, or put it into grants to sort of help primary producers who were growing water-intensive crops like rice and cotton, grants to help them move into less water-intensive crops. So many ways that money could have been spent to actually make a real difference to water consumption in Victoria, but no, they whipped us up to spy on each other and pit neighbour against neighbour. Anyway, and do you know what? The next week, an old guy who was just watering his roses, and by the way, it happened to be on the day that the houses on his side of the street were allowed to water their roses, like that made a big difference. And this thug walking past and decided to have a go at the old fella, then punched him and killed him. I couldn't believe it. This poor old guy who wasn't hurting anyone, just watering his roses, lost his life. And and not only that, like the guy that killed him, I'm pretty sure, would have issues for the rest of his life, knowing that he'd killed some poor old guy that was just watering his roses, and all because he was whipped up by the media to think that some old guy watering his roses is really going to make a difference to the drought. And I've noticed it in other things too, like the whole Muslim and terrorist things at the moment that we're supposedly so terrified of, or have been whipped up to be terrified of. And in particular, I've noticed that our government seems to really target the most vulnerable in our society and encourage us to point fingers and of blame, or feel like Centrelink recipients are sucking the country dry. We have they use phrases such as the lifters and the leaners, and apparently the lifters are the likes of Joe Hcokey and Bronwyn Bishop and Tony Abbott, and the leaners are Centrelink recipients. And here, it seems like everything they do is kind of mean towards Centrelink recipients. Joe Hcokey spent $50,000 flying a celebrity chef over to Washington to prepare lunch for him and some delegates. And then he came back to Australia and cut funding to Meals on Wheels. So elderly pensioners miss out on their little Meals on Wheels package, but Joe Hcokey didn't have to miss out on his celebrity chef at $50,000 flying all over the countryside. Um, Christopher Pyne, our Minister for Education, tells us that we can't afford to educate our children free, yet he had a free education. And there's, Tony Abbott's daughter, kid just benefiting from a $60,000 free scholarship to get through university. And we're being told that Centrelink recipients, students and pensioners and the unemployed, are sucking this country dry. Tony Abbott said the most stupid thing. Joe Hcokey says it too, but Tony Abbott, I'm paraphrasing, but it's close. He said, we can't abolish poverty because we can't stop poor people from drinking, we can't stop them from smoking, we can't stop them from gambling, and we can't stop them from making the kind of mistakes that mean they end up less wealthy than they might otherwise have been. That's so ridiculous. Making mistakes that make like making mistakes like not having a daddy who can get us a free $60,000 scholarship through uni, And Gina Rinehart says the same thing. She paints every Centrelink recipient as some kind of beer drinking, cigarette smoking layabout, and yet when she didn't feel like paying the mining tax, she poured millions of dollars into media manipulation as well. Australians were surveyed and said that they did not want the mining tax. They didn't even know what the mining tax was. They just knew that it was apparently bad and we had to stop it. Tony Abbott lists the abolishing of the mining tax as one of the greatest achievements the Liberal government have achieved. How did that benefit you? How did that benefit your life? It didn't benefit any one of us. It benefited Gina Rinehart, and she's up there saying that poor people are poor because they drink and smoke too much. Well, she's not. She's up there sucking the country dry and refusing to pay tax herself. She's a leaner, not the Centrelink recipients. And it doesn't help that SBS and their reality shows portray Centrelink recipients as all being the same as the handful of Centrelink recipients that they happen to have on their show. It's just crazy. Not every Centrelink recipient is sitting around swigging beer, smoking ice, and having babies so that they can buy more widescreen TVs. Centrelink recipients are students studying so that they can take our country into the next generation. Centrelink recipients are writers and painters and dancers and poets and Bush Tucker experts and comedians and actors and musicians and elders teaching languages that are going to be extinct if they don't teach them to youngsters, and really valuable contributors to this country and to our society, just as valuable as Gina Rinehart to our society, and all just as deserving of a few crumbs of the wealth that this country has, all just as deserving as Joe Hcokey or Bronwyn Bishop or Francis Abbott or Gina Rinehart. Please stop pointing fingers at each other and stop demonizing the most vulnerable among us, because the real leaners are the ones that are telling us to point fingers elsewhere.